June 23, 1944, 08:15 hours. Villers-Bocage, Normandy. The Sherman Firefly's 17-pounder gun was still warm when Hauptmann Heinrich Becker climbed through the blown-out turret hatch. His boots crunched on spent brass casings as he dropped into the fighting compartment, the acrid smell of cordite and burnt metal filling his nostrils. The British crew was gone, fled into the Norman hedgerows after a Panther's 75mm round had disabled their track. But they hadn't destroyed their tank. Around Becker, the morning battle was still raging. The distinctive crack of German 88s mixed with the deeper boom of Allied artillery. But for a moment, Hauptmann Becker stood motionless in the cramped turret of this abandoned British tank, staring at the massive gun before him, and felt something he hadn't experienced since the invasion of Poland. Fear. Not the immediate fear of combat, but something deeper, more fundamental. This gun, this ordinary-looking Allied tank with its impossibly long barrel, represented a shift in the war that German High Command had either missed or refused to acknowledge. Within 48 hours of examining this captured Firefly, Becker would write a report that his superiors would classify and suppress. Within 2 weeks, that report would reach the desk of General Heinz Guderian, who would read it twice before setting it down and saying to his aide, "If the British can do this to a Sherman, we've already lost the technological war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." To understand Becker's shock, one must first understand what the Sherman Firefly represented, not just mechanically, but philosophically. The Sherman tank, designated M4 by the Americans, was by 1944 the most numerous tank in the Allied arsenal. American factories had produced over 49,000 of them. They were reliable, easy to maintain, and could be produced in staggering numbers. They were also, by German standards, inadequate. The standard Sherman mounted a 75mm gun that German tankers had learned to respect but not fear. At 500 meters, a Sherman 75mm could penetrate roughly 76mm of armor. A German Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of nearly 140mm. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Shermans could not reliably penetrate Panthers from the front. Panthers could destroy Shermans from virtually any angle at any combat range. German tank crews had developed a confidence bordering on arrogance. Lieutenant Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, wrote in his combat diary, "Engaging Shermans is target practice. They burn beautifully. We call them Tommy Cookers or Ronsons, after the lighter, because they light first time, every time." This tactical superiority had been demonstrated repeatedly since D-Day. On June 7, 1944, SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann had destroyed 25 Allied vehicles, including 14 tanks, in 15 minutes at Villers-Bocage. His Tiger tank had carved through a British armoured column like a scythe through wheat. The engagement had become legend in the Panzerwaffe, proof of German technical superiority. British tankers knew they were outgunned. Trooper Joe Ekins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry later recalled, "Going up against Tigers or Panthers in a regular Sherman was suicide. You needed 5 Shermans to take out 1 Panther. 4 would die, the 5th might get a side shot if he was lucky and brave." The British answer to this problem was ingenious in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. If American Shermans couldn't mount a pound gun capable of defeating German heavy armour, the British would do it themselves. They took the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the war's most powerful anti-armour weapons, and through considerable engineering effort, fitted it into the Sherman's turret. The modification required enlarging the turret ring, redesigning the recoil mechanism, removing the hull machine gunner to make space for ammunition, and adding a massive counterweight to the turret's rear. The result was ungainly, the barrel so long it required an awkward muzzle brake. But it worked. The 17-pounder could fire a 17-pound armor-piercing shot at 2,950 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor. At 500 yards, 171 millimeters. These weren't incremental improvements over the standard Sherman. This was a complete revolution in capability. A Firefly could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. It could destroy a Panther from any angle within 1,000 yards. Suddenly, the mathematical certainty of German armored superiority had been invalidated, but German intelligence had missed it. The first Fireflies had landed on D-Day, June 6, 1944. British crews had been instructed to camouflage them, to paint over the distinctive long barrel with mud, to position them behind regular Shermans. The British wanted their secret weapon to remain secret as long as possible. German tactical intelligence had noted longer-barreled Shermans, but assumed they were standard 76mm variants. The Americans were indeed fielding 76mm Shermans, an improved but still inadequate gun. German commanders assumed the British were using the same weapon. This assumption was about to be shattered at Villers-Bocage, in the cramped, bloody fighting compartment of a captured tank. Hauptmann Heinrich Becker was not a typical tank commander. Before the war, he had been an engineer at the Krupp Steelworks, involved in armor metallurgy. He understood not just how to fight tanks, but how they were built, their capabilities and limitations. He had been pulled from the Eastern Front in May 1944, assigned to Panzer Lehr Division as a technical intelligence officer. His job was to examine captured Allied equipment and assess its capabilities. On the morning of June 23rd, his unit had overrun a British position near Villers-Bocage. Among the destroyed and abandoned vehicles was a single Sherman, track blown, but otherwise intact. Becker's commander, Major Werner Schulze, had radioed him. "Heinrich, we have a captured Sherman here. Something odd about it. The gun is enormous. Come look." When Becker arrived, he immediately saw what Schulze meant. The barrel was absurdly long, extending nearly 16 feet from the turret face. His first thought was that it might be a captured German gun, perhaps a Panzer, a 4-barrel mounted as a field expedient. But as he climbed into the turret, that theory evaporated. The breech mechanism was British. The ammunition racks held rounds he'd never seen before. He pulled one out, nearly dropping it from the unexpected weight. The shell was massive, far larger than the standard 75mm Sherman round. The brass casing was stamped with British proof marks and a designation 17 PR APDS. 17-pounder armor-piercing discarding sabot. Becker felt his mouth go dry. He knew what a 17-pounder was. German intelligence had captured the towed version, knew its capabilities. It was one of the best anti-tank guns in the war. But mounting it in a tank, in a mass-produced Sherman, that the Allies could field by the hundreds, that changed everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He examined the gun mount, the recoil mechanism, the ammunition storage. Everything about the installation spoke of sophisticated engineering. This wasn't a field modification. This was a factory conversion, planned, tested, and produced. Which meant there weren't just 1 or 2 experimental vehicles. There could be dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands. Becker climbed out of the turret and found Schulze. "We need to report this immediately. This isn't a 76mm. It's a 17-pounder. This tank can kill Tigers." Schulze looked skeptical. Heinrich, you're sure? The British putting their biggest gun in their weakest tank. It makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, Becker replied. They have thousands of Sherman chassis. They have the 17-pounder. They've solved their armour problem by converting existing vehicles. This is brilliant, and it's terrifying. That afternoon, Becker began his examination in detail. He measured the gun, photographed the breech, documented the ammunition. He fired several rounds at a destroyed German half-track at 400 meters. The results were devastating. The 17-pound projectile punched through both sides of the half-track, the entrance hole clean, the exit hole massive. He examined German tank armor plates his unit had brought for comparison. At 1,000 meters, he calculated, this gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther. At 500 meters, possibly even a Tiger. The implications cascaded through his mind like falling dominoes. Every tactical advantage German heavy tanks enjoyed, the ability to engage at range, the confidence of frontal immunity, the mathematical superiority of armor and firepower, all of it was gone. A Sherman Firefly could sit in ambush and destroy German heavy tanks before they even knew they were under effective fire. The long barrel made Fireflies identifiable, which meant German tank commanders would have to target them first. But in the confusion of combat, in Norman hedgerows where visibility was measured in dozens of meters, would they see the difference in time? And how many Fireflies were there? His unit had encountered one. Were there 10 in every British armoured regiment? 20? 50? Becker spent the evening writing his report. He was methodical, technical, unemotional. He documented dimensions, performance, probable capabilities. He concluded with a section that would later be quoted in post-war analyses. The Sherman Firefly represents a fundamental shift in Allied anti-armour capability. Previous Sherman variants could be engaged with confidence by German heavy tanks at combat ranges. The Firefly eliminates this advantage. A tank that previously required 5 enemy vehicles to defeat one of ours can now achieve parity or superiority. Given Allied production capabilities and the ability to convert existing Sherman chassis, we must assume widespread deployment. Current tactical doctrine, which relies on armour superiority and standoff engagement, must be immediately revised. The report went up the chain of command. Major Schulze forwarded it to regiment. Regiment sent it to division. Panzer Division's intelligence officer, Hauptmann Rudolf von Ribbentrop, read it with growing concern and sent it to 5th Panzer Army headquarters. At each level, the report was read, noted, and filed. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. No one wanted to tell their superiors that German armour superiority, the foundation of mobile warfare doctrine, was being challenged by a converted American tank. On June 27th, 4 days after Becker's initial examination, Trooper Joe Ekins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry was commanding a Firefly in the village of Rauray. His squadron had been engaged in heavy fighting with elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. Through the smoke and confusion of battle, Ekins spotted a Tiger tank at approximately 800 meters. The Tiger crew hadn't yet identified his position. Ekins laid his sights on. The Tiger's hull, adjusted for range, and fired. The 17-pounder's report was distinctive, deeper than a standard Sherman, a crack that British tankers learned to recognize instantly. The armour-piercing round crossed 800 meters in just over 1 second and struck the Tiger's lower hull plate. The Tiger shuddered. Smoke began pouring from the engine deck, and within seconds the crew was bailing out. Ekins would destroy 2 more Tigers that day, including one commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Whitman, the same tank ace who had destroyed the British column 3 weeks earlier. Whitman, the invincible Panzer ace with 138 tank kills, died when a 17-pounder round penetrated his Tiger's turret. German units in Normandy began reporting encounters with long-barrel Shermans with increasing frequency. Panzer commanders who had grown accustomed to engaging Shermans with near impunity were discovering that some Shermans could shoot back with lethal effect. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Lieutenant Hans Hofer wrote in a letter home, dated July 3, 1944, "We encountered British tanks yesterday. From the front, they look like regular Shermans, but some have barrels like artillery pieces. One destroyed Meyer's Panther from 1,000 meters, straight through the frontal armor. We thought we were safe at that range. We were wrong. The men are nervous now. Every Sherman might be one of these Fireflies. We can't tell until they shoot, and by then it might be too late." This uncertainty, this loss of confidence, was perhaps as damaging as the Firefly's actual capabilities. German tank doctrine since 1940 relied on armor superiority and aggressive tactics. Panzer commanders were trained to close with the enemy, to use their superior guns and armor to dominate the battlefield. Now, closing with Allied armor meant risking instant destruction from a tank that looked identical to dozens of others until it fired. The paranoia spread. Every Allied tank had to be treated as potentially lethal. Every engagement required caution. The aggressive, confident panzer tactics that had served Germany so well in Poland, France, and Russia were being replaced by hesitancy. Meanwhile, Becker's report finally reached someone who understood its implications. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armoured Troops, received a copy on July 7, 1944. Guderian, one of the architects of German armoured doctrine, read it twice. His aide, Major Hans Speidel, later recalled, "The general set the report down and was silent for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he said, 'If the British can mount a 17-pounder in a Sherman, they've solved their tank problem, and we can't solve ours.'" Guderian understood what others had missed. Germany's tank production was limited by industrial capacity, raw materials, and increasingly by Allied bombing. In 1944, Germany would produce approximately 8,000 tanks of all types. America alone would produce 21,000. The British would add another 5,000. But numbers weren't the critical factor. The critical factor was that the Allies could take their existing vehicles, tens of thousands of Shermans already in service, and upgrade their firepower through conversion. Germany couldn't do the same. Their tanks required complete redesign to mount heavier guns. Each improvement meant months of retooling, production delays, debugging new systems. The Panther had taken years to develop and was still plagued by mechanical problems. The Tiger II, with its 88mm long-barrel gun, was entering production, but at a rate of perhaps 25 per month. The Firefly conversion could be done to existing vehicles, in field workshops if necessary. Britain had converted roughly 2,000 Shermans by the end of 1944. Each one represented a threat that German heavy tanks could no longer dismiss. Guderian ordered tactical doctrine updated immediately. Panzer commanders were instructed to identify and target Fireflies first in any engagement. Tank recognition guides were updated to highlight the distinctive long barrel, but these were reactive measures, attempts to mitigate a problem rather than solve it. The fundamental equation had changed. For the first time since 1940, German armour did not have a clear qualitative advantage. Back in Normandy, Hauptmann Becker continued his analysis. He examined 2 more captured Fireflies in July and August, documenting improvements and modifications. The British were refining the design, improving the mounting, enhancing the sighting systems. He noted in his August 15th report, Examination of 3 Firefly variants shows continuous improvement in installation quality. The British are not just converting vehicles, they are perfecting the conversion. Latest examples show improved gun stabilization and enhanced optics. Crew training appears excellent. Captured ammunition stocks indicate no shortage. We must assume this vehicle has become standard in British armoured regiments. He was correct. By August 1944, British armoured regiments typically fielded 1 Firefly for every 4 standard Shermans. This ratio was carefully calculated. Enough Fireflies to provide serious anti-armour capability, but not so many that German forces could easily identify and prioritise them. The Fireflies were typically commanded by the most experienced gunners, men who could make that critical first shot count. The tactical impact was measurable. British tank losses in Normandy were still heavy. The Sherman's thin armour remained a liability. But Firefly crews were accounting for German heavy tanks at ratios unthinkable for standard Shermans, where previously it might take 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther, with all 5 taking casualties. Now a single Firefly could achieve the same result from ambush. The mathematical calculus of armoured warfare was shifting. It wasn't that the Firefly made Shermans equal to German heavy tanks in all respects. The Sherman's armour was still inadequate. Its mechanical reliability, while good, couldn't match German engineering at its best. But the Firefly gave Allied armour a weapon that could kill German tanks before they could effectively respond. In tank warfare, the ability to kill the enemy is more important than the ability to survive being hit. German tankers began adapting their tactics in response to the Firefly threat. Oberleutnant Gustav Schrodeck, commanding a platoon of Panther tanks in the 2nd Panzer Division, developed a protocol that would become standard across German armoured units by September 1944. His after-action report from August 28 described the new reality. Upon encountering Allied armour, all commanders must immediately scan for long-barrel variants. These must be engaged first, regardless of tactical positioning. A Firefly at 800 metres is more dangerous than 3 standard Shermans at 400 metres. We have lost the luxury of choosing our targets based on convenience. We must choose based on survival. This represented a complete inversion of German tactical doctrine. Previously, Panzer commanders had been trained to engage the closest threat first, to use their superior range and armour to methodically eliminate enemy vehicles. Now they were being forced into a defensive posture, scanning desperately for the 1 tank in 5 that could actually hurt them, while ignoring closer threats that were still deadly if allowed to manoeuvre. The psychological toll was significant. Unteroffizier Werner Rahn, a Panther gunner who had fought in Russia and France, wrote in his diary on September 12, 1944, "In Russia, we feared the 34 for its numbers and the KV for its armour, but we understood them. We knew their capabilities and limitations. These Fireflies are different. They hide among regular Shermans like wolves in sheep's clothing. You cannot tell them apart until they fire, and that first shot might be the last thing you see. Klaus was killed yesterday by 1. His Panther was hit from 900 metres through the turret front. He never even saw which tank fired. The British are learning to position their Fireflies behind regular Shermans to use them as screens. By the time we identify the Firefly, we are already under fire." This tactical adaptation, using standard Shermans as sacrificial screens for Fireflies, was exactly what British commanders had begun implementing. Lieutenant Colonel John Mogg of the 4th County of London Yeomanry issued tactical guidance in August that would become doctrine. Fireflies are to be positioned in overwatch or secondary positions. Regular Shermans will advance and draw fire, allowing Fireflies to identify and engage German heavy armour from covered positions. The Firefly's long barrel makes it identifiable, Therefore it must shoot second but hit first. This created a brutal calculus for British tank crews. Standard Sherman crews knew they were being used as bait, drawing German fire to expose enemy positions for the Fireflies. Yet they accepted this role because it was effective. Trooper Dennis Chapman of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry explained the logic in a 1978 interview. "We knew our 75s couldn't hurt Panthers from the front, but we could make them shoot at us, make them reveal their positions. Then our Firefly would nail them. We lost mates that way, good men in regular Shermans who died drawing fire. But it worked. Before the Fireflies, we lost 5 tanks for every Jerry we killed. After, maybe 2 for 1, sometimes better. Those odds meant more of us went home." The mathematics were cold but undeniable. British tank losses in Normandy from June through August 1944 were approximately 1,500 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. But German losses were nearly 800 panzers, an unprecedented loss ratio for an army on the defensive in favourable terrain. The Firefly wasn't solely responsible for this shift. Allied air superiority and artillery played enormous roles, but it represented a fundamental change in ground combat dynamics. By September 1944, German tactical intelligence had compiled enough data to understand the scope of the problem. Major Wilhelm Ritter, intelligence officer for the 1st SS Panzer Corps, produced a detailed analysis that reached OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, on September 19th. His report was remarkable for its bluntness. The Sherman Firefly has effectively neutralized German armor's qualitative advantage. Statistical analysis of engagement reports from June through August shows the following. Standard Sherman versus Panther, German victory 92% of encounters. Sherman Firefly versus Panther, Allied victory 67% of encounters. Sherman Firefly versus Tiger, Allied victory 54% of encounters. These figures represent a complete reversal of the tactical situation that existed prior to June 6th. Most critically, Firefly production and deployment continue to increase. British armoured regiments now field approximately 20% Fireflies. Some elite units have reached 30%. At current production rates, the British could theoretically convert all Shermans in European theatre to Firefly standard within 18 months. We have no counter to this except producing more Tigers and Panthers, which our industrial capacity cannot support at necessary rates. The report included a section that would prove prophetic. The Firefly represents a new paradigm in weapons development. Rather than designing entirely new vehicles, the Allies are adapting existing platforms with improved weapons. This allowed them to leverage their mass production capabilities while achieving performance parity with our specialized vehicles. If this approach is applied to other systems, aircraft, anti-tank weapons, artillery, German technical advantages will be systematically eliminated without requiring Allied production of completely new equipment types. Ritter had identified something German High Command didn't want to acknowledge. The Allied approach to military production was fundamentally different from Germany's. German doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, specialized vehicles optimized for specific roles. The Tiger was a magnificent tank, nearly invulnerable in frontal engagements, mounting a gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges beyond retaliation. But Germany could only produce about 1,300 Tigers during the entire war. The Allies were producing adequate platforms in overwhelming numbers, then upgrading them as needed. A Sherman wasn't as good as a Tiger, but a Sherman Firefly was good enough. And the Allies could field 10 Fireflies for every Tiger Germany produced. This philosophical difference extended throughout military production. Germany developed the Panther as an answer to the Soviet 34, creating a technically superior tank with excellent armor, mobility, and firepower. But the Panther was complex, expensive, and prone to mechanical problems, especially early in its production. The Soviet Union produced 58,000 34s. Even if the Panther was twice as effective as the 34 in combat, which was debatable, the numbers made the outcome inevitable. The Firefly exemplified Allied pragmatism. Take an existing, reliable platform. Add the biggest gun that will physically fit. Accept the compromises. The cramped turret, the removed hull gunner, the awkward balance. The result might not be elegant, but it worked. And it could be. Produced in numbers that made German technical superiority irrelevant. Hauptmann Becker, whose initial report had tried to warn of this reality, watched the implications unfold through the fall of 1944. He examined 4 more captured Fireflies between September and November, documenting the evolution of the design. His October 23 report noted improvements that disturbed him. Latest Firefly variant shows enhanced crew ergonomics despite cramped conditions. Ammunition storage has been optimized. Most significantly, installation quality has improved to the point where these conversions appear to be factory standard rather than field modifications. The British have fully industrialized Firefly production. We must assume capability to convert Shermans to Firefly standard at rates limited only by gun production, not vehicle availability. He was observing the maturation of what would later be called weapons platform evolution. The Sherman chassis proved adaptable to numerous variants. Beyond the Firefly, Americans developed the Mountain tank destroyer, the M7 Priest self-propelled artillery, the M32 recovery vehicle, the M4 A3E2 jumbo assault tank. A single reliable chassis could be adapted to multiple roles, spreading development costs and simplifying logistics. Germany attempted similar approaches with the Panzer IV chassis, but never achieved the same scale. German industry was hampered by dispersed production, Allied bombing, and a tendency toward over-engineering. The Panther required over 4,000 man-hours to produce. A Sherman required approximately 10,000 man-hours, but American factories were producing them 24 hours a day in facilities that dwarfed German tank plants. The Rouge River Ford plant alone, converted to tank production, had more floor space than all German tank factories combined. By November 1944, the Firefly had become such a priority target that German tactical manuals included specific identification guides. Tank commanders were trained to spot the distinctive long barrel even in poor visibility or at extended ranges. Special recognition training emphasized the Firefly's profile, the muzzle brake configuration, the turret counterweight. But this emphasis on identifying and targeting Fireflies created its own problems. Oberleutnant Schrodeck, whose unit had been engaging Allied armour since August, noted in his November 15th report, "The imperative to locate and destroy Fireflies first has created tactical paralysis. Commanders spend critical seconds scanning formations for long-barrel variants, time that would previously have been used engaging targets of opportunity. In fluid combat situations, this hesitation has proven fatal. Yesterday, Lieutenant Bauer's Panther was destroyed by a standard Sherman from the flank, while Bauer searched for Fireflies to the front. The Firefly obsession is becoming as dangerous as the Firefly itself. This represented exactly the kind of psychological impact that effective weapons systems create. The Firefly's presence didn't just threaten German tanks physically, it disrupted German tactical decision-making. Tank commanders who had once operated with aggressive confidence now second-guessed every engagement. The mental calculus required to identify, prioritize, and engage targets had become complex enough to slow reaction times in combat environments where seconds determined survival. British and Canadian forces were exploiting this hesitation. Squadron commanders learned to use their Fireflies as psychological weapons as much as physical ones. Major Robert Boscawen of the Royal Tank Regiment described the tactic in post-war interviews. "We'd position our Fireflies in defilade, hull-down positions where only the turret and that lovely long barrel were visible. Jerry could see we had Fireflies, but couldn't engage them without exposing himself. Meanwhile, our standard Shermans would maneuver for flanking shots. The Germans were so fixated on the Firefly threat, they'd sometimes ignore closer, more immediate dangers. We were using the Firefly as a matador uses a cape, drawing their attention while the real killing blow came from elsewhere." By December 1944, approximately 2,100 Fireflies were in service with British and Commonwealth forces in Europe. This represented roughly one Firefly for every 4 to 5 standard Shermans, exactly the ratio British planners had determined was optimal, enough to provide serious anti-armor capability, not so many that the vehicles lost their tactical surprise value. The production logistics were impressive. Converting a standard Sherman to Firefly specification required approximately 200 man-hours. This could be done in dedicated conversion facilities in Britain or by skilled workshops in the field. The 17-pounder guns were being produced at rates exceeding 500 per month by late 1944, split between towed anti-tank versions and tank-mounted variants. The ammunition supply chain was equally robust. Each Firefly carried 77 rounds of 17-pounder ammunition, a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive shells. This was fewer than the standard Sherman's 97 rounds, but the Firefly rarely needed more. Its purpose was killing tanks, and 1 or 2 hits from a 17-pounder would destroy any German armor. The effectiveness of the weapon system was creating demand for more. Canadian armoured regiments requested increased Firefly allocations. Polish armoured divisions wanted them. Even American units began requesting Fireflies, though American doctrine preferred the 76mm armed Sherman and tank destroyer doctrine over the British approach. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hogan of the American 4th Armoured Division wrote in his December 19th report, "Observed British Firefly performance during Ardennes fighting. Single Firefly destroyed 2 Panthers from ambush at approximately 700 yards. American 76mm Shermans engaged same targets without success. Request evaluation of Firefly for American service or development of equivalent capability." This request went nowhere. American armor doctrine was different, emphasizing tank destroyers like the M36 Jackson for anti-armor work, while using Shermans primarily for infantry support. But Hogan's report reflected a growing recognition that the British had solved a problem American planners were still struggling with. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble in the West, provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of the Firefly's impact. During the Battle of the Bulge, British Thames XX Corps was deployed to secure the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, equipped with a mix of standard Shermans and Fireflies, engaged elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army on January 3, 1945, near Bourret, Belgium. The engagement was brief but decisive. German forces, spearheaded by Tiger IIs from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, encountered British positions at dawn. The Tigers were the latest German heavy tanks, mounting 88mm long-barrel guns and frontal armour up to 180mm thick. They were theoretically immune to any Allied tank gun at combat ranges. Theoretically, Sergeant George Dring commanded a Firefly positioned in a hull-down position overlooking the approach to Bourret. His account, recorded in regimental histories. We saw them coming up the road, 2 tigers leading. Massive things, like cathedrals on tracks. I ranged the lead tiger at about 900 yards, waited until he cleared the tree line for a clean shot, put the sight on his lower hull where the armor is thinnest and fired. 17-pounder cracked like thunder. Saw the tracer hit, spark, and the tiger stopped dead. Smoke from the engine deck. Second tiger spotted us, started traversing his turret. I fired again, hit him in the turret ring. His gun stopped moving. Both tigers were done in under 30 seconds. The engagement continued for another 20 minutes, with British Fireflies accounting for 3 tigers and 2 Panthers without loss. The German attack stalled, not from overwhelming force, but from the sudden realization that even their heaviest armor wasn't safe. The psychological impact on German tank crews was devastating. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, a Tiger II commander who survived the engagement, later stated, "We thought the Tiger II was invincible. 18-centimeter frontal armor, the most powerful tank in the world. Then one shot from a Sherman, we didn't even know it was a Firefly, penetrated our hull. The round went through armor we believed was impenetrable. It didn't destroy the tank, but it killed our confidence. If a Sherman could hurt a Tiger, too, nothing was safe." This loss of invulnerability was perhaps the Firefly's greatest contribution. German armoured doctrine since 1939 had been built on technical superiority. German tanks were better armoured, better armed, better engineered than their opponents. This superiority justified aggressive tactics, confident manoeuvres, the kind of operational boldness that had won campaigns in Poland, France, and early Russia. The Firefly didn't eliminate German armor's advantages, but it narrowed them to the point where German tankers could no longer operate with the assumption of invincibility. Every engagement now carried real risk. Every Allied tank formation might contain Fireflies. The certainty that had underpinned German tactical confidence for 5 years was gone, replaced by caution, hesitation, and fear. And in armoured warfare, where speed of decision often determines survival, that psychological shift was as devastating as any gun. The technical specifications that made the Firefly so effective were rooted in British desperation and ingenuity in equal measure. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun had been designed in 1941 as Britain faced the reality of German armour superiority in North Africa. British 2-pounder and 6-pounder guns were proving inadequate against upgraded German tanks, and intelligence reports indicated even heavier German armour was in development. The 17-pounder was Britain's answer, a weapon designed from the start to defeat any tank Germany could produce. The gun fired a 17-pound projectile at velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. The armour-piercing discarding sabot round, developed specifically for the 17-pounder, used a tungsten carbide penetrator that could defeat armour through sheer kinetic energy rather than explosive force. This gave the weapon remarkable performance against sloped armour, which had been designed to defeat conventional armour-piercing rounds. The challenge was mounting this powerful weapon in a mobile platform. British tank design in 1943 was in flux. The Cromwell cruiser tank was entering service, but couldn't accommodate the 17-pounder without extensive redesign. The Churchill infantry tank was too slow for the mobile operations planned for the invasion of Europe. The Challenger tank, specifically designed around the 17-pounder, was entering limited production, but would never be available in sufficient numbers. The solution came from an unlikely source. Major George Brighty of the Royal Artillery's Tank Design Department proposed mounting the 17-pounder in the Sherman. The idea was initially dismissed as impossible. The Sherman's turret ring was too small, the recoil too powerful, the weight too great. But Brighty persisted, and by February 1943, a prototype had been built. The modifications were extensive but achievable. The turret ring was cut and expanded. The recoil system was redesigned to direct forces downward rather than backward. The radio was moved from the turret bustle to the hull. The hull machine gunner position was eliminated to create space for ammunition storage. A large counterweight was added to the turret rear to balance the massive gun. The result was cramped, awkward, and barely workable. But it worked. By September 1943, production conversions had begun. The first Fireflies reached British armoured regiments in January 1944, just 5 months before D-Day. The crews who received them were initially sceptical. The Firefly was clearly a compromise, a weapon forced into a chassis never designed for it. The turret was so cramped that the loader had to work in contorted positions. The long barrel made the tank nose-heavy and difficult to handle in rough terrain. The muzzle brake, necessary to manage recoil, created a distinctive blast signature that revealed the tank's position with every shot. But when crews fired the 17-pounder for the first time on training ranges, skepticism vanished. Sergeant Thomas Boardman, one of the first Firefly gunners, described his initial live-fire exercise. They set up a captured Panzer IV hull at 800 yards. We'd been plinking at it all morning with 75s, making dents but no penetrations. Then I got in the Firefly and fired one shot. The round went through the front armour, out the back, and buried itself in the dirt 30 yards beyond. One shot, complete penetration. We all just stood there, staring. The captain said, "Well, I think that'll do." Training on the Firefly was intensive. British doctrine called for the best gunner in each troop to command the Firefly, ensuring the weapon was used to maximum effectiveness. Gunners trained specifically on rapid target acquisition and first-round hits. The doctrine was simple. The Firefly would likely only get one shot before being identified and targeted. That shot had to count. Crews learned to identify German armour at extended ranges, to distinguish Panthers from Panzer IVs, Tigers from Panthers. They memorized armour layouts, weak points, kill zones. The 17-pounder could penetrate German heavy tanks, but only if the shot hit the right place. A hit on a Panther's frontal turret armour might not penetrate. A hit on the hull, where armour was thinner and less steeply sloped, would. The tactical employment evolved through combat experience. Early Firefly crews tried to use their tanks like standard Shermans, moving with their troop, engaging targets as they appeared. This proved costly. The Firefly's long barrel and distinctive profile made it a priority target for German gunners. Fireflies that exposed themselves in open manoeuvre were quickly identified and destroyed. By August 1944, British armour doctrine had evolved. Fireflies were designated as support weapons, not frontline brawlers. They would take hull-down positions, using terrain to conceal everything but the turret and gun. From these positions, they would overwatch their troops' advance, ready to engage German heavy armour if it appeared. This made the Firefly a defensive weapon in offensive operations, providing insurance against German counterattacks, while standard Shermans handled the advance. The doctrine worked because British and Canadian forces were fighting in terrain that favoured defensive gunnery. The Normandy, with its high hedgerows and narrow lanes, provided endless hull-down positions. The Belgian forests offered similar advantages. German tanks attempting to advance or counterattack had to expose themselves, while British Fireflies could remain concealed until the moment of firing. The ammunition logistics for the Firefly were more complex than for standard Shermans. The 17-pounder used separate loading ammunition, with the projectile and propellant charge loaded independently. This was slower than the fixed ammunition used by American 75mm and 76mm guns, but allowed for different propellant charges to be used with the same projectile. Standard armor-piercing rounds used full charges for maximum velocity and penetration. High-explosive rounds used reduced charges, saving barrel wear. The armor-piercing discarding sabot round was the Firefly's primary tank-killing ammunition. The round consisted of a tungsten carbide core, or penetrator, held in a lightweight aluminum sabot. When fired, the sabot fell away after leaving the barrel, and the dense penetrator continued to the target at tremendous velocity. The small cross-section and high density gave the APDS round exceptional penetration against both vertical and sloped armor. But APDS rounds were expensive and in limited supply. Tungsten was a strategic material, needed for machine tools and armor-piercing ammunition. British production of APDS rounds never fully met demand. Firefly crews typically carried a mix of APDS for engaging heavy armor, standard armor-piercing for medium tanks, and high explosive for soft targets and infantry support. The scarcity of APDS ammunition created interesting tactical constraints. Firefly commanders had to judge whether a target warranted the use of a precious APDS round or could be engaged with standard ammunition. A Panther at 700 meters in a good firing position absolutely required APDS for a reliable kill. A Panzer IV at 400 meters could probably be destroyed with standard armor piercing, saving the APDS for more dangerous targets. These calculations had to be made in seconds, under fire, with incomplete information. The stress on Firefly crews was immense. They knew they were priority targets. They knew German doctrine was to identify and destroy Fireflies first. Every time they fired, their position was revealed by the distinctive muzzle blast and smoke. They had to hit with the first round because they might not get a second chance. Trooper Arthur Reddish, a Firefly loader with the Staffordshire Yeomanry, described the experience. The moment the gun fired, we'd be reversing, trying to get back into cover before Jerry could put a round on us. Sometimes we made it, sometimes we didn't. Lost 3 loaders in our squadron in 2 months. It was the most exposed position in the tank because you had to stand up to load that big round. But we kept doing it because we knew we were the only thing that could stop Tigers and Panthers reliably. The casualty rates for Firefly crews were higher than for standard Sherman crews, but not as dramatically as might be expected. The Firefly's tactical employment, using hull-down positions and firing from concealment, partially offset its vulnerability, and when Fireflies were lost, it was often after they had achieved their mission, destroying the German heavy armor that threatened their formation. The exchange rate was generally favorable. A Firefly might be destroyed, but not before, taking out 1 or 2 German heavy tanks worth many times its production cost. By January 1945, German armor strength on the Western Front had been ground down to a fraction of its June 1944 levels. The Ardennes offensive had consumed the last strategic reserves of German armor. Replacement tanks were arriving at rates of dozens per month when losses were measured in hundreds. The Firefly had contributed significantly to this attrition. Every German heavy tank destroyed by a Firefly was a tank that couldn't be replaced. Germany's production capacity in early 1945 was a shadow of its 1943 peak. Allied bombing had systematically destroyed tank factories, component suppliers, and transportation networks. What production remained was increasingly devoted to tank destroyers and assault guns, cheaper and faster to produce than proper tanks. The psychological impact on German tank crews by this point was profound. Obergefreiter Paul Schneider, a Panther driver captured in February 1945, told his interrogators, "We knew about the Fireflies from training. They showed us pictures, told us to identify them and engage them first. But in combat, you can't always tell. Sometimes you see the long barrel and know it's a Firefly. Sometimes you don't see it until the round hits you. We lost more tanks to Fireflies than anything else in December and January, not because they were everywhere, but because when they shot, they killed. One shot, one kill. It got to where seeing any Sherman made us nervous. Was it a Firefly? Would this be the one that gets us? That uncertainty, that constant fear, it wore us down worse than the actual fighting. This erosion of confidence was exactly what effective weapons systems achieve. The Firefly didn't need to be present in every engagement to be effective. The possibility that it might be present was enough to alter German tactical behavior, to slow reaction times, to introduce hesitation into decisions that needed to be made instantly. The Firefly had become what military theorists call a fleet in being, a threat that shapes enemy behavior through its potential presence rather than actual employment. The contrast with German tank development during the same period is instructive. Germany's response to Allied armour improvements was to build heavier tanks with bigger guns and thicker armour. The Tiger II, entering service in mid-1944, weighed 70 tons and mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. It was a magnificent achievement of engineering, perhaps the most powerful tank of the war. But Germany produced only 492 Tiger IIs. The tank was complex, expensive, and required specialized facilities to produce. Each Tiger II represented thousands of man-hours of skilled labor and tons of strategic materials. And despite its formidable capabilities, it could still be destroyed by a Firefly at combat ranges. The Tiger II's frontal armor was nearly impregnable, but the Firefly could penetrate the side armor at 700 meters and the rear armor at any range. British doctrine adapted accordingly. Avoid frontal engagements with Tiger IIs, maneuver for side shots, use terrain and combined arms to create engagement opportunities. The Tiger II's weight and complexity actually made it vulnerable. It was too heavy for many bridges, too wide for some roads, too mechanically complex for field repairs. Tiger IIs broke down frequently and consumed fuel at prodigious rates. A tank that couldn't move was just an expensive pillbox, easily bypassed or destroyed by artillery. The Firefly, by contrast, retained the Sherman's mechanical reliability and logistical simplicity. It required no special transport, no unique spare parts beyond the gun itself, no specialized training for maintenance crews. A Firefly that broke down, it could be repaired by any Sherman-qualified mechanic. This maintainability was crucial in sustained operations. British armoured regiments in the winter of 1944–45 maintained operational rates of 70 to 80%, meaning that 7 or 8 out of every 10 tanks were combat-ready at any given time. German panzer divisions were lucky to maintain 50% operational rates, and some units fell below 30%. Superior individual tank performance meant nothing if the tanks couldn't be kept running. The final campaigns of the war, from the Rhine crossings in March 1945 through to VE Day in May, saw Fireflies in action across the breadth of Germany. By this point, German armoured resistance was sporadic. Fuel shortages immobilized entire panzer units. Those tanks that could move were often destroyed by Allied aircraft before they could engage ground forces. When German armour did appear, Fireflies were usually among the Allied tanks that destroyed it. The battle for Cologne in early March 1945 provided one of the war's most iconic tank engagements. A German Panther, one of the last operational tanks in the city, was making a fighting withdrawal down a city street when it was engaged by a Sherman Firefly of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment. The engagement was captured on film by an American combat cameraman. The footage shows the Panther reversing down the street, firing at American infantry. The Firefly appears from a side street, takes approximately 5 seconds to aim, and fires. The 17-pounder round strikes the Panther's flank and penetrates. The Panther shudders, smoke pours from the hatches, and the crew bails out. 1 shot, 1 kill, captured on film for history. By April 1945, German tank strength in the West had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Individual tanks and small groups fought on, often immobilized by lack of fuel, and used as static of defensive positions. The Firefly's role in this destruction had been significant. From June 1944 through May 1945, Fireflies were credited with destroying over 1,000 German armoured vehicles, including approximately 450 heavy tanks of the Tiger and Panther types. These figures represent roughly 30% of all German armour destroyed by British and Canadian ground forces, achieved by tanks that represented only 20% of British armoured strength. The efficiency of the Firefly as a tank destroyer was remarkable. Standard Shermans achieved kill-to-loss ratios against German heavy armour of approximately 1:3, meaning 3 Shermans were lost for every German heavy tank destroyed. Fireflies achieved ratios of approximately 2:1, meaning 2 German heavy tanks destroyed for every Firefly lost. This 6-fold improvement in efficiency came from a weapon system that required only modest modifications to an existing platform. The cost-effectiveness was staggering. A Tiger tank cost approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks to produce and required 8,000 man-hours of labour. A Sherman cost $45,000 and required 10,000 man-hours. Converting a Sherman to Firefly standard added perhaps $5,000 and 200 man-hours. The result was a tank that cost 1/6 as much as a Tiger and could destroy it in combat. From an industrial warfare perspective, the Firefly represented everything Germany couldn't match: rapid adaptation, efficient use of existing resources, good enough solutions deployed in overwhelming numbers. Germany's approach, pursuit of technical perfection in limited numbers, couldn't compete with Allied pragmatism at scale. The lessons of the Firefly would influence tank design for decades after the war. The concept of upgunning existing platforms rather than designing entirely new vehicles became standard practice. The Israeli modification of Sherman tanks with French 105mm guns in the 1950s and 60s created the Super Sherman, which fought successfully against Soviet-supplied Arab armour in multiple wars. The principle was identical to the Firefly. Take a proven chassis and give it a gun capable of defeating current threats. American tank development in the Cold War followed similar patterns. The M60 tank series used the same basic chassis for decades, with successive models featuring improved guns, armour, and fire control systems rather than complete redesigns. The Monet Abrams continues this tradition, with multiple upgrade packages extending the platform's service life far beyond original projections. The Firefly proved that weapons platform longevity came from adaptability, not initial perfection. A good chassis with upgrade potential was more valuable than a perfect design that couldn't adapt to changing threats. This lesson, learned in the Norman, hedgerows and Belgian forests of 1944 and 1945, continues to shape military procurement decisions into the 21st century. For the men who fought in Fireflies, the war ended with a mixture of relief and pride. They had crewed the tank that evened the odds against German armour, that gave British forces a weapon capable of defeating the best Germany could field. Trooper Joe Ekins, who had destroyed Michael Whitman's Tiger, survived the war and lived until 2007. In his final interview, he reflected on the Firefly's significance. "We knew we were in the underdog tank. The Sherman wasn't as good as the Jerry tanks in most ways, but that 17-pounder, that was the equalizer. It meant we had a fighting chance. It meant German tank crews couldn't just roll over us with impunity. That gun saved a lot of Allied lives, I think. Maybe it saved mine. The Firefly served with British and Commonwealth forces until the early 1950s, finally being replaced by the Centurion, Britain's first universal tank design. Some Fireflies saw combat in Korea, where their 17-pounders proved effective against North Korean 34-85s. The last Fireflies were retired from service in 1956, over a decade after their combat debut, a remarkable service life for what had been conceived as an expedient field modification. Today, approximately a dozen Fireflies survive in museums and private collections worldwide. The example at the Bovington Tank Museum in Britain is maintained in running condition and occasionally demonstrated for visitors. The distinctive crack of the 17-pounder, deeper and sharper than a standard Sherman's 75mm, still turns heads and reminds those who hear it of what this ungainly, improvised weapon system achieved. The Sherman Firefly was never the best tank of World War II. It wasn't the fastest, the most heavily armoured, or the most reliable. It was a compromise, a field expedient, a good gun forced into an adequate chassis through engineering determination and wartime necessity. But it was good enough, produced in sufficient numbers, crewed by brave men, and employed with tactical intelligence. And in the end, that was enough to help win a war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.